Prologue. Königsberg, December 14, 1814. Fritz sat beside his brothers, watching the show. One of the clowns fell down again, and he and little Abbot roared with laughter. The lady on the horse was so wonderful. He remembered his mother having told them of the times when she and her sister, Aunt Freda, had attempted to ride standing up. It had always led to nearly disastrous tumbles, but neither of them had actually broken their neck, or even their leg. There she goes, he cried, as the woman did a flip, gracefully landing again on the horse's back as it trotted around the ring. He looked at his brothers and then back again at the performers, seeing what each was watching. Little Abbot now sat, staring as if transfixed, at a beautiful young girl who played the flute and swayed back and forth. In front of her was a large snake, which swayed in unison with her movements. "Helmken, you can't be bored." He nudged his brother's arm. Wilhelm sat staring at the ground, looking very bored indeed. "Yeah, Fritz, I am. I wish we hadn't come here. Carly, shouldn't we go now?" Wilhelm asked, turning in his seat. "Nein, I wish to hear what he has to say," Karl said. Karl sat watching the man at the back of the ring, who seemed to be directing everything. At first, Karl hadn't been able to take his eyes off the girl as she swayed in a sort of dance, the snake following her. Her gauzy dress shimmered and seemed almost as if she too had scales like the snake. But he had glanced away to watch the man at the back of the ring. He had said something, but Karl hadn't been able to understand. Then the man looked at him. He couldn't tear his gaze away, so he had begun to study him, trying to identify something about him which seemed vaguely familiar. That seemed strange, as he had never met gypsies like these before. When the man spoke, his German was hard to understand. He spoke with a strong accent of some Eastern tongue. Finally, the horse lady stopped riding and the clowns had disappeared. But the music of the flute continued. The man rose and came forward, presenting little Abbot with a piece of fruit. He took it and looked up at the man. "Danke," he said, his mouth dripping with juice as he stuffed the whole piece in his mouth. Wilhelm also took a piece, so did Karl, but Fritz did not. The man walked about, offering fruit, sweets, or flowers to people in the crowd. Occasionally he would pause, speaking low in his own language, as if to himself. Finally, he returned to his seat at the back of the ring. Then, suddenly, he cried out loudly some mysterious word. "Abbot, come back here. Papa said not to let you go off alone," Fritz cried, starting forward, but Karl pulled him back. "I want to see what happens," he whispered. Wilhelm rose, and so did many others in the crowd. They all walked forward and turned in unison. They all had strange, blank expressions on their faces. They continued to walk about, never colliding, even though from their faces they appeared to be asleep. Suddenly, at another word from the man, all of them smiled. The man shouted something again, and the crowd began to mill about, seeming confused. "How did I get here?" one man asked. "I didn't leave my seat." Fritz was looking about in the crowd for Abbot and Wilhelm, and while his back was turned, Karl slipped away. He saw the man was following him, and he slipped behind one of the buildings. "Prince Karl," the man said. Again, something about the man seemed strangely familiar. Karl studied his face. As he looked at his face more closely, he studied his eyes. They were green, like his. Karl was the only one in the whole family with green eyes. "How do you know who I am?" he asked. The man took his cloth out of his pocket and rubbed at a small part of his cheek. The dark tan disappeared. He was as fair as Karl was himself. Karl. His voice was no longer so strongly accented. It seemed strangely familiar. It sounded, Karl realized, very like his father's. You are, Karl said, looking up at him quizzically. I am your uncle, Louis Karl, who everyone thinks died 18 years ago, he said. Karl gaped at him. You're our Uncle Louis, Aunt Frida's first husband? He nodded. And I am not only your uncle. Now you must be told what your Abbot Wilhelm comes to, and where is Karl now? Why won't you stay together like Papa told us? Fritz took his brother's hands and began to walk about. Go to the carriage and stay there, he said, watching to make sure his brothers did as he said. He turned back, stepping closer to the side of a building nearby. He had seen Karl and the man who had seemed in charge of the show. But why would Mama do that? She was all Fritz heard Karl say as they walked back the other way. Who was this man who was telling Karl something against Mama? Dear beautiful Mama, who had died 4 years ago, depriving Prussia of her best statesman, as the enemy Napoleon himself had called her. Fritz felt tears spring to his eyes and decided to break into this conversation. It was time to go. Karl, kommst du jetzt? He called, stepping forward. Karl jumped as Fritz spoke, but stepped toward him, looking up challengingly. You can't tell me what to do. You're not the king. I will be, and you must obey Wilhelm too, as he too is your elder. Fritz stepped forward, taking hold of his arm. Who is that man? What do you think you're doing? Papa told us to stay together, he said, walking swiftly to the carriage. I'm obeying orders, Karl said, smiling mockingly. You're such a mother hen, Fritz. Let us enjoy ourselves when we can, before the next battle begins. He put his hand in his pocket and took out a note. See what he wrote? He thrust the note into Fritz's hand. Fritz unfolded the note. Karl tried to snatch it back, seeing that he had given him the wrong one. What are you talking about, Karl? And who is Dorothea? Karl turned his face away. Fritz didn't need to know what he knew. It wasn't his right to know, even if he was the heir.